Hey everybody, it's Eric from epautos.com, your libertarian car guy, and I'm trying to come to grips here with this Dodge Challenger Hellcat. Goddamn those bastards for dropping this thing off. Giving me this car, this 707 horsepower car, was like giving a junkie a suitcase full of heroin and saying, "Here, hold this for me for a week." I've had it 2 days now, and so far I've managed not to get arrested, which is quite something. I have been wrestling with the words to come to grips with and convey to you what this car does, is all about. Where to even begin? 707 supercharged horsepower under the hood. Let's look under the hood. While I'm doing that, I'll continue my monologue here. Those of you who may remember the original muscle car era might remember the 426 Street Hemi. That was one of the strongest muscle car engines ever put into a factory-produced muscle car back in the 60s. It made 426 horsepower. Gross, SAE gross, which for those of you not in the know means likely overestimated. Up until 1972, the car companies used the SAE gross standard, which meant that the engine was on an engine test stand and often free of power sapping, factory-type full exhaust systems and even some accessories. After 1972, they began to use the currently in place SAE net standard, and the result of that was that most of the horsepower ratings declined by about 20 to 30% or even more. So if the 426 Street Hemi's 426 horsepower SAE gross rating was overestimated by 30%, it probably made about 375 horsepower, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt. Some Mopar people believe it was actually underrated, and that was probably the case. So let's spot it 100 and something horsepower, 150 horsepower even. It's still nowhere even close to being in the ballpark of what this thing puts out. 707 horsepower, 650 foot-pounds of torque. Try and get your head around that. It's hard. By the way, side thought, cool thought. Notice that the engine does not have a plastic cover, and that's because there's actually something to look at here and something to be proud of. Also notice the valve covers are painted the correct Hemi orange color that Chrysler used back in the day, and not just on the 426 Hemi, but also on big blocks like the 440 Magnum Super Commando engine, which I remember from back in the day. Now, the Charger Hellcat and the Challenger Hellcat are basically the same car, with the difference being that this one's got 4 doors and the other's got 2. This one is my preference for 2 reasons. One, it's a lot cheaper. It's $58,000 or so to start versus $62,000 for the Challenger. The other thing is, look at it. It's a sedan, and if you get it like this one is, in a silver color or another kind of nondescript color, I guarantee you, you can float along in traffic and not be as vulnerable to the gendarme as you would be in the Challenger, which is an obvious offender. A clear muscle car coupe, and like a Corvette or a Camaro or a Mustang, you're going to be the one that gets picked out if you're in a group of cars and you're all speeding. That's the one that's going to get nailed, not this one. This one looks to the average person who's not a car person just like a Charger. Maybe a Charger with big wheels and some body kits, but you know, a lot of cars have that. It really doesn't clue you in, unless you're an initiate, to what this thing is capable of. Alright, I'm going to get in and drive it and let it warm up. Another little bit of commentary I'd like to make here too is that we've kind of come full circle. Back in the day, the original era muscle cars, here we go, became the targets of various inquisitions because they had 300, maybe 350 horsepower, let's even say 400 for some of the stronger ones. And that was a lot for the 15-inch and even 14-inch wheel and tire technology of that era, the late 60s and the early 70s, to cope with. Young guys tended to wrap them around the trees. and the result was that the insurance costs went through the roof. Now, 40 years later, 40-something years later, horsepower has more than caught up to, has passed the capabilities of tire technology. When you have 707 horsepower and 650 foot-pounds of torque going through the back wheels, even with launch control, even with stability control, this is a car that can get away from you if you're not careful. This is not a car for teenagers. So it's probably a good thing that the price of this thing is close to $60,000, at least in that sense. Now, it's a bad thing in that a lot of people are just never going to have the experience of driving this car. All right, enough of that part of the rant. Let's just have a scan around the interior here and look at some of the things that you get in addition to that supercharged 6.2 Hemi under the hood. You get this really pretty and brash interior layout with the sport buckets and the Alcantara trim, red accents. It reminds me a lot of the brash and bold Mopars of the past, which were always more brash and bold than any other car company's muscle cars. You also get a unique gauge cluster. There's the boost gauge up to 9 pounds of boost, factory setting for the supercharger, the 200-mile-an-hour speedometer, which this car is fully capable of doing. And then here in the main cluster, well, this part is standard issue charger, but here you got some extra buttons. You got your launch control here, and if you hit this button, SRT, it will pull up the various settings that you can program into it. It tells you what the horsepower is, and transmission, paddle shifters, traction, and suspension. And here are your options. You can customize it, you can set it for sport. I'm going to put it on track. When you put it on track, you get the full horsepower, you get really aggressive shift points, including tire chirping, 1-2 changes, and fishtailing. The traction and stability control are set on their most forgiving settings, which means you can fishtail and throw the car around. The suspension is firmed up to its firmest settings. And also you can enable the launch control, like here if you push this, the race options, and then you can activate the launch control, you can set your RPMs, you even have a shift light here. Even though this thing has a rev limiter, but you have a shift light, so if you're bracket racing, you can get into that stuff. With the launch control activated, basically it's pretty much point and click. You tap the brake and nail the gas, and the thing goes down the quarter mile. About 11.8 seconds at about 130 or close to 130 miles an hour. It's unreal. If you don't have it on, be very careful, because you literally will fishtail all over the road. Let's get going here a little bit, and I'll give you some sense of what the thing can do. Back it up, back it up, back it up. It's a little wet outside, so I'm going to have to be even more careful, because despite having 20-inch wheels and Pirelli P0 Ultimate Sport tires on it, you just don't get traction in this thing with that kind of power and torque on hand. It's pretty quiet though, isn't it? Look at that. Holy shit. Excuse me. Look at that. And that was just a slight tap of the gas. Slight tap of the gas. But to get back to the civility thing, this is a perfectly wife drivable street car with air conditioning on. Idles relatively smoothly. The exhaust has a nice little burble to it, but it's not obnoxious. So I'm guessing that this engine, in the tune that it's in, could easily be jacked up like another 100 horsepower or so, easily, and still not be on the close to airy side. Anyway, I'm going to do some actual driving of this thing in another video, but that's my initial commentary about the car. Come on down to epautos.com for more. Thanks for viewing, and we will catch up with you on the flip-flop.